Okay, Linda says we're straight, so that means we're ready to begin. Mostly it's just the camera. Like sometimes it's hard to tell. It can feel a little bit sideways. And I feel like I should do that one time, just record it where the camera is sideways so that you all think that your monitor's like not in the right direction. So today we have to talk about a little bit of a puzzle. And it's not a puzzle with an easy solution. One of the tables asked, and it's a great question, when did the persecutions begin? That's a good question. I asked the same one. The best answer I can tell you is, it's hard to say. Because part of it is we don't have records of it all. Some of the things that were done, the Romans just didn't write down very much of. And so we have snippets and snapshots in different places, and we have to sort of try and put things together. And it really raises the first question, which is, what do you mean by persecution? And that too is a challenge, because if you remember, we were talking about the Roman Empire before. It's kind of hub and spokes. And so Rome itself and the major cities, the capitals of the provinces, are going to have a different experience of persecution by and large than people in the countryside would. They also have a different experience of Christianity. Christianity spreads much more quickly in the cities first, because there's people there, and they're around, and they're in contact with other people. So Christianity spreads there first, but that's also where the persecutions are most intense, because they're most connected to the city of Rome. It was a little bit like, you could say, in the pandemic, the difference between like the big city of Fargo and the small town of Harvey. Or the small town of, what's a good small town? Carlsruhe. That's a lovely town. The small town of Carlsruhe. You know, the people in Fargo make all these rules about masks and social distancing, and the people in places like Carlsruhe basically rolled their eyes. And by the time they finally started wearing masks, people in the city had just about stopped. Like, it just took a lot longer for it to come down to that level. So when you ask, like, when did the persecution start, it's a little bit like, well, what is it? Because if you mean something emperor-wide enforced by imperial decree, that's much later, like in the time of Decius. We'll talk about him in a little bit, like 250. But there's all kinds of evidence that there was some persecution earlier. It just wasn't as widespread, or it happened in kind of flashes and bangs instead of a prolonged period of persecution. Does that make a little bit of sense? And I think this is something that our author covers fairly well. He kind of mentions how this picture that for several hundred years the Romans ran around and killed every Christian they saw on sight isn't accurate. They didn't do that. At the same time, it's not accurate to say that there were no persecutions. Like, those are the two extremes. It wasn't everyone died, and it wasn't no one died. It's in the middle. And so there's a little bit of a complicated history with it. Does that make a little bit of sense? Like, I hope so, because it's sort of like, well, why? And part of it, one of the things in the ancient world to remember is that it takes a long time to get messages between places. So Rome decides something, and it's not heard about in other places for, maybe several weeks. If there's a storm at sea, the messengers might have all died. And then, eventually news would get back to Rome and the emperor, but they'd have to send out another ship, or it might come by land, later. Snowstorms, all that kinds of stuff. Like, we don't like snowstorms and blizzards now and the problems that they cause on roads, right? Driving a horse-drawn carriage makes it worse. Like, horse-drawn carriages and all-wheel drive SUVs are not the same. It's one of the funny things, if you watched The Chosen, we've talked about it before, but I thought one of the funnier scenes is when these Jerusalem officials are riding up to Galilee and the thing keeps bouncing and they keep shaking. And he's like, get off me! And they're like trying to push each other away. And it's like, yeah, they didn't have suspension springs to make it nice and easy. Every rut in the road that was made out of rocks, they felt, if you had a road at all. And if you didn't have a road, it probably wasn't all that different from what they call minimum maintenance roads now, but are much more artistically known as prairie trails. And you can bump and bump and bump on those and feel a little bit like, they can make even not really squeamish people car sick. All right, so we begin the history of the persecutions with Claudius. And Claudius actually shows up in the Bible. This one is biblical. This one comes out in the book of Acts. There's two Jewish people that we know of that show up in the book of Acts named Priscilla and Aquila. This is where Bishop Aquila gets his name from, but the accent is actually on the first letter. So it's Aquila, and it means eagle. Priscilla and Aquila, this happens around 51. There seems to have been a big fight in the synagogue in the city of Rome, likely between the Jews and the Christians. It's not exactly clear, but there's some big fight, and the emperor hears about it. It causes a social disturbance. And so the best way to handle social disturbances is to kick them all out. If you don't have any of the people anymore, then they can have their social disturbance in the countryside, and you can have your nice peaceful city. So it's because of this person that they call Chrestus, with an C-H-R-E. But lots of the scholarly tradition would say this is probably a corruption of the very, very similar Christus, C-H-R-I. And if you were a Roman and you didn't know the difference, Christ and crest sound very, very similar. And so you can imagine an emperor, it's a little bit like the game of telephone, that he gets upset and he's like, what are they fighting about? And someone could have said Christus or Crestus or something, and he's like, oh, whatever, just get rid of them all. It's probably something like that. It seems like the conflict was spilling into the streets. And so what you start to see is the Roman concern for civic order. We talked about the Roman civitas, the Roman civic duty, civilization. All of those concepts kind of go together. And the history of the persecution is hard to understand without thinking about the concern for civil order. Disorder is dangerous. Disorder is destructive. You don't have an empire when you have disorder. And so the Romans were relatively brutal. Like, you didn't riot, because the Romans didn't have, like, the right of the accused. When you rioted, the soldiers came and killed you. That wasn't... The only time people really rioted is if you had some soldiers on your side, so your soldiers could fight their soldiers. But they're very, very concerned about it, and they're brutal. When rebellion comes around, the Romans, there's no fudging. There's no like slimy lawyers that are going to get you off. The getting off is getting your head cut off and not getting tortured. That's getting off. So there's a great suspicion of political rivals. You could say if you were writing Roman commandments, one of them is you shall not rival Rome. They countenance no other power that sets themselves up in opposition to themselves. So if you recall, like the Jewish revolt in the Holy Land that we talked about before, like in the 60s and 70s AD and then in 130, the Romans, they're not kind when they're putting down a rebellion. And you see that here, at this time, in the early time, Jews and Christians are lumped together. Very, very quickly, the Jews will be cut out. The Jews will be like, we don't want any part of this Christianity thing. And the Jews actually have some decrees from the Romans, somehow they managed to get them, that they should not be persecuted. They should be left alone. So when Rome issues these decrees about worshiping Roman gods, it doesn't usually apply to the Jewish people. They don't force the Jewish people to do it. If you're Jew, you're fine. It's the Christians that they're after. The Romans, if you remember, their religious system is also not very cohesive and not very inspiring. So they have this problem with superstitions. People have superstitions. They were superstitious about just about everything because they don't know. They don't recognize like natural powers and gravity and thunderstorms and all those sorts of things. That's part of it, but also because the Roman religious system isn't very satisfying. If you remember, we talked about like looking at bird guts and entrails and those kinds of things, the augurs before. That's like Roman religion. And so what happens? Well, that's not very inspiring, and so the people start making their own religion. They make their own traditions. This happened to you because you kicked the black cat. This happened to you because you looked at the moon when you weren't supposed to on the wrong day or whatever. They're superstitious. And so what happens is Christianity and this new religion become sort of linked together in the Roman mind. Like this Christianity thing is just another one of these dumb superstitions that people have that are destroying the civic order of Rome, and they don't have Roman gods. Why can't you just be normal and have Roman gods? The Christians also tend to meet in secret. They do meet at night, not so much in cemeteries, but they do meet at night. And it's mysterious. They don't talk about what they do at their meetings to people that aren't part of it because of the pushback that they're receiving from the Romans. And if you look up Roman religion at this time, you'll find Mithras cults and mystery cults from the East and all these other things. So the Roman authorities are kind of aware of religious problems. And they don't really know what to do because they're super committed to the old Roman way, the Roman gods and all that, but they know that that's not really working. So at first they try to enforce it by force. And you know as parents that this always works really well. When you really want someone to do something, you just force them to do it. That doesn't breed resentment, and it doesn't breed problems, and it doesn't, make people try and figure out how to get around your rules, except when it does. So the Roman authorities start to say the breakdown in society and the problems in the empire aren't because we're running things badly and not because we're stretching the limits of communication, but because you aren't worshiping the Roman gods. You see how easy it is to scapegoat that way? Like rather than admitting the social and political problems of trying to rule a giant empire that stretches for thousands of miles and includes, tens of millions of people, it's the Christians' fault. They're not worshiping Roman gods. And so why is Rome starting to, be attacked by the barbarians? Because you don't worship our gods enough. That will play into the history of persecution. And so you have to kind of see how these different pieces are all parts of the puzzle. They all kind of go together. You can't separate out, the persecutions are just because the Romans hated the Christians. It's like, no, they're trying to answer some real questions. Social disorder is a challenge. Like the United States, for instance, before the advent of modern communication, it was a bit harder to control the whole country. There's a reason why, for much of our history, the frontier was a dangerous place to be, because you didn't have a lot of connection back to the cities in the east and to the government. The government in Washington can say what they want, and if you're looking for gold in the hills of Arizona, their rules don't matter very much. Part of our ability to govern a nation of this size is because of communication, because we can communicate. Very early on, they made telegraphs and then radios. Those are actually quite old. and steam engines and all of these different inventions that were happening basically enabled our country to exist. Well, Rome has kind of the same problem, and they don't have any of the inventions. And they have this idea that you can't be a good citizen, you can't be a part of the empire unless you fulfill the responsibilities of citizenship. And so you can start to see how citizenship and worshiping Roman gods go very closely together. And the Christians very quickly are going to say, nope, not gods, not worshiping them, at least in large part. The Christians don't really meet in catacombs. That's one of the other kind of misnomers. Like, yes, they meet at night. Yes, they celebrate Mass on the tombs of the martyrs in different places. But catacombs aren't places where you can have large groups of people, and they don't start building them until the 2nd and 3rd century. At least the oldest ones that we've found are like 200s, 300s-ish, not here in the 1st century. So, Emperor Nero. Nero is the first bad guy. Nero is probably the guy in the book of Revelation who gets the number like 666 and is the evil Roman killing the Christians. Which is a good reason why many people think the book of Revelation was written in the late 60s and not much later in the 90s or the 100s, like some people would say. So Nero has a problem, and this is a problem that still doesn't make sense to me. I have no idea how you do this, because they don't build things out of wood in Rome. But there ends up being this giant fire. How does fire burn rocks? I mean, you can do it, but you need a really, really, really hot fire to burn rock. Like, how did they get that? I don't know. But somehow, there's a giant fire that starts in the city of Rome. Nero might have started it himself. He was kind of, we would have some 4-letter words for him, but a politer way to say it, he was kind of a jerk, and he was an egomaniac. He was emperor, and he was going to do what he wanted to do. And lots of it is really creepy. Don't read the stories of the Roman emperors if you want to sleep well at night. Many of them were not nice people. Nero is one of them. So this fire starts, and because buildings are close together and there is no fire department, fires were a major, major danger in cities. When they started, they almost always spread. And they don't have large sources of water that you can just pour on it. And they don't have hoses, and they don't have like all of the things that are necessary for firefighting. If you watched the news last night, there was a house up near Grafton that burned. And that fire was caught relatively early, and we have fire departments, and they came out and they sprayed it with a whole bunch of water, and they got it contained. And it still did a crazy amount of damage. Imagine like some of the giant forest fires when you don't have anything to slow it down, really. I mean, sure, you can have a group of people and you can pour water buckets on it, but pouring water buckets on a blazing inferno does very little to get to the heart of it. So fires are a big danger. There's a big one in the city of Rome, and Nero wanted to rebuild a bunch of things and wanted to steal people's houses and do that stuff, so he could have started it himself. But conveniently, he decides to blame the Christians. It is the stupid Christians' fault. And again, so you have to see that Christianity is already on the Roman radar. They're already thinking about it. They're already like, you know, they're concerned. Some of that superstition stuff, they must have heard about it, because he decides the convenient scapegoat is the Christians. And Nero is not nice. So the Roman historian Tacitus, Rome is one of the first places that actually has like official historians that write histories of things, which is very helpful when you're studying it later. When he's writing about Christians, he says, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to flames and burnt, to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle. So the old image is actually fairly accurate, that Nero crucified the Christians and then would light them on fire to be torches for his parties at his palace. He was mean. They would sew them into animal skins and then let lions go after them and do that kind of stuff. If you can imagine depravity and you can start taking it to a pretty extreme level with people that have near infinite power in the ancient world, this is what you have. You have Nero. And Nero's a bad dude. This is when Peter and Paul die. Peter and Paul both die in the Neronian persecution. Nero is likely insane. By the end of his life, he kills himself. But his decree gives a legal basis and a precedent to later persecutions. But his decree seems to be most focused on the city of Rome. So he doesn't empire-wide kill all the Christians. This is in the city of Rome, he goes after the Christians. Now some, eager beaver governors in other places, remember that people always want to curry favor with the empire too. So if the emperor decides that he's going to kill Christians in the city of Rome, and you're a yes man who is ambitious and wants to be in higher favor and get a higher position, what do? You're I'm going to kill even more Christians than the emperor. I'm going to prove how faithful I am. And so governors did that. But it wasn't super widespread. It would be relatively local and relatively contained at this point. But it does allow, this decree of Nero is what is appealed to by later emperors when they want to launch persecutions. Their justification or their legal basis for doing it is Nero made it illegal. A good jurist, a good legal person would say, yeah, but he was insane. We shouldn't follow the dictates of insane people. That's not a good way to live. But whatever. When things are convenient, it's amazing how it works. And sometimes it works in both directions. One of the funniest things is that the current treaty that governs relations between the Vatican and Italy was signed by Benito Mussolini. When you look at the history of World War II, it's wait, that's a head scratcher. Really? Yep. Benito Mussolini, who worked with the Nazis, is the one who signed the current treaty between the state of Italy and the Vatican. I don't know why, but that's the way it goes. So this Nero thing launches the ability to attack Christians legally. Religious litmus test. It became kind of a litmus test for people. It would work kind of like racism does today. When you really wanted to get someone, when you were angry, let's say you defrauded someone and they called you on it, and so you were mad at them, and you were going to be hauled before the court. Instead of admitting your crime, what do? You accuse them of being a Christian. Because that's illegal. And if you've already committed a crime, then you really don't have very many rights. So this becomes very much a reason for hatred and racism. But as I said, at least in the time of Nero, we don't have record of it being like a worldwide or empire-wide genocide. There's a few areas where it's happening, mostly in the city of Rome, but not everywhere. Part of it is also because the Christians very, very quickly decide to remember their dead. So they made lists of names of those who have died for their faith, and they kept them. And they prayed to them, they canonized them. These became the saints and their heroes. But it's very, very possible that they wrote down every single name of every single person that died that they could get a hold of. Now remember, there's also other forms of persecution. It's not just killing people. That's the most extreme. And so that is a lot less common than exile, than stealing property, than administrative problems, destruction of property. Those kinds of things were happening a lot more often. This is the case, for instance, in communism today, in Russia and China and lots of places like that, where they don't usually actually kill the Christians. They just do their best to get rid of their books, their Bibles, their ability to read things. They make it illegal to teach the next generation. Like, they use all of this administrative garbage, all of this bureaucracy. That's the major form of persecution. It's probably like that in this early time as well. The pagans were jealous. One of the other things is that the pagan priesthood, remember, is a very, very powerful political group. The politicians are all tied to priesthood. That's very, very connected. And so as the priests start to lose power, as they start to lose followers, as people start to reject this way of worshiping idols, the priests get mad. And so they start stirring up people to attack the Christians. There's a kind of hatred and a kind of jealousy that develops from the paganism and the pagan authorities that is against the Christians. It also happens that there's other economic things. Paul encounters this in the book of Acts. If you remember, some of these merchants get upset when people won't buy their idols any longer, and so they stir up a riot, and I think that's one of the times that Paul gets stoned. They do that. They do stuff like that. If you become a Christian and you stop buying idols, and the craftsmen are going out of business, what do the craftsmen do? They go complain to the politicians that your business is going down and, jobs are being lost. This is the same rhetoric that's used today, and it's kind of batty. Like, this has happened in places that have legalized marijuana and try to impose more restrictions. Now, if they try to impose new restrictions on it, the drumbeat is, we're going to lose jobs. It's like, yeah, jobs are involved in a drug trade, but that's what they do. Like, this is the way that the rhetoric works. So that's what happens at this time. Christianity largely has to hide. It wants to hide. They have this discipline of the secret, but it largely has to. Ceremonies are kept more secret. It's harder to see openly. People would not openly admit to being Christians very often. Churches aren't built until the late 3rd or 4th century. So in the later part of the 200s, the oldest churches that we have date from that time, not before. And I would say I haven't been entirely able to find out why. Persecution is part of it, but it's not the whole story. The leadership, priests and bishops, are the ones who are attacked the most. Like priests, bishops, teachers, and the books, the scriptures, the writings of the saints. Those are what they're after most often. Lay people, not as much. Fewer people are part of this movement. Not as many people become Christians when becoming Christian likely means your death. Like, that's the way that they would see it. And I think it's something that we should wrestle with now. That we really have to ask, like, if you would likely die for becoming Christian, if you would likely die for being baptized or having your kids baptized, would you be as ready to do it? Is Christianity worth everything that you have? Would it be worth losing your family? Would it be worth losing your friends? Would it be worth losing your job and your source of security? Those are things that we have to ask. And, I think it's good for us to admit that it's a hard choice. This isn't an easy position to be in. And in one sense, it's really easy to say, oh yes, I would. I love Jesus like that. And it's like, it's a lot harder to do when someone's holding a gun to the head of your kid and they're like, okay, do this or I shoot them. That's not an easy position to be in. So it starts to spread. Domitian is the next major guy. He's kind of major persecution number 2. He launches something that's more widespread than the time of Nero. He starts to attack the hierarchy much more directly, and the nobility. So again, he's not going after rank and file, freed slaves, that kind of people, but the nobles, the people that are part of society, the people that have large estates and also have lots of money that he can steal, yep, they're kind of on the hit list. Domitian is the emperor that has the Apostle John killed. Or he tries. It doesn't work. The story of the death of the Apostle John is sort of funny. They try to cut off his head and the axe breaks on his neck. They try to boil him in a pot of oil and he doesn't cook. And they do all of these other things and they just can't kill him. So eventually they exile him to an island called Patmos. And there he has his visions that form part of the book of Revelation as well. The Emperor Trajan. So Domitian is sort of increasing persecution, starting to use more official pressure. Trajan is the one that has Ignatius of Antioch killed, but he's sort of we're not going to go after them. We're not in the business of killing people. It's bad for business. It's bad for the future of your empire. You shouldn't kill your own citizens. So his policy becomes much more if a Christian is accused to you, you should investigate and discover. But he's pretty suspicious of people who are giving these false accusations because they realize very quickly it's being used politically and not really religiously. This is being used badly to take over things and to attack things in ways that aren't good. So he's, in the sense of Christianity, he's much more cautious. He's not insane like Nero was, and he's not as much of a jerk as Domitian was. Trajan is, I think, considered to be one of the first good emperors. In his time, the empire is expanding to its largest size that it covers. And he is a little bit concerned that Christianity alone isn't a crime enough to kill someone. That's what they're kind of wrestling with. Is Christianity in and of itself criminal enough for someone to be killed? The later emperors, so in the 2nd century, they mostly continue these earlier policies. So this is in the 100s. Some local officials, some places attack Christians, but it's not empire-wide or widespread. Some slaves denounce their masters as Christians. This is a way to get revenge for slavery. Although remember that slavery wasn't American slavery in the South. It wasn't nearly as extreme, and it was rarely physically violent like happens in the United States now. It was much more of a civic state. It was just, it was sort of like being white European or black or, Pacific Islander. It was much more like that than we would consider now. Because at this time, something like 30 or 40% of the people in the empire were slaves. And so it's a very large group of people. But there are slaves that do try and take revenge on their masters by denouncing them as Christians. And they probably know, if you ever read an Agatha Christie novel, you know that the servants know everything. Everything that you think is hidden and every little secret that you have, they know it all.